Since I've started making more of these videos and just, speaking to more people, and I guess just kind of being in this work in general more closely, I've noticed there's some reoccurring patterns going on with a lot of people that tend to play out again and again. And one thing that you'll probably be very familiar with and are probably actually suffering with yourself in some way is this desire to be a certain way or to sort of introduce some new behaviours. One thing that people tend to always say to me is that obviously I've got these ideas of the things I want to do and I know what I need to do. I know that they're going to move the needle for me and get me closer to where I want to be, but I just can't stick to them consistently. Or I might make some progress and then I'll fall off. Because they really strongly desire to actually be this way, they've built a lot of emotion around it, and then when they fall off they end up chastising themselves and thinking they're a really bad person for not being able to stick to the things that they know they actually want to do. And then from that state they might be seeking motivation, motivational videos or like tactical stuff in order to be able to make those changes. But then if you've been doing this, take a step back and really look and think, has this cycle ever actually changed anything? You'll probably find that it's just something that repeats and repeats and repeats. And I think a lot of people get lost in this because usually the time it takes to where you've started to get motivated, maybe made a few changes and then slipped back, occurs over quite a lengthy time period. It can be like a month or a couple of months. And in that way, it's hard to see that it is a repeating cycle. If this is you, really take a long view. Have a look over maybe a few years or something like that and think, have I been doing this same thing and has it actually moved the needle forward for me? So if you're able to look back over your sort of past and like the patterns that you've been doing and repeating, I think it's, safe to say that it hasn't been working if you've not really seen much progress. And in my opinion, we need to take a completely new approach to this, a total paradigm shift in the way that we approach this stuff. One of the biggest things I think that is tripping people up on this is because of the very paradigm of society. This is why it's so difficult to actually change, because everything you see around you is set up in a certain way of thinking. Everyone behaves a certain way, and that's because they think in a certain thinking pattern as well. And even if you're somebody that's quite aware of this stuff, you could call it like the matrix programming, it still affects you. And I used to always think that because I knew about it, that it didn't affect me, but you're so saturated in it, there's no way that it can't affect you on some level. It's kind of like if you imagine living in a polluted city and thinking that because you know it's polluted that it doesn't affect you. So if we come from that premise that everybody has been conditioned somewhat, some people have more conditioning that's stronger and some people have less, but we all have it to some degree. And it's like the old rose-tinted glasses analogy. If you imagine that you'd had those glasses on for so long and it was so familiar that you forgot that you were wearing them, and now you just thought everything in the world was pink. So for an example, if you think about somebody that believes everyone is going to humiliate them, maybe they had a really bad past experience that sort of traumatized them, and then now they see the world in that way. We've all met these people before. They hyper focus on every mannerism of somebody they're speaking to, and they might take like, what did that look mean? Like, are they disapproving of me now? Are they laughing at me? And that sort of stuff. And because they're seeing it in that way, that's all they're able to see. Whereas the reality of it might be completely untrue and they're just reading into everything way too much. So it's only when you become aware of that paradigm and how the world is operating in this way, everyone's kind of doing the same thing, that you begin to be able to take some autonomy over your own actions and thinking patterns and start to undo some of that conditioning and move in the direction you want rather than just being pulled along by life. And as I said, some people are totally conditioned and stone cold asleep to this. They're not even aware there's a paradigm to begin with. It's like the fish in the pond doesn't know there's anything else other than the pond. That's all he's ever known. Some people you can't even say this stuff to because it goes just straight over the head, and in extreme cases they can actually become defensive because it's like you're threatening everything they know. And it's like that line in The Matrix when Morpheus is talking to Neo and he says most people are so dependent on the system that they'll actually fight to protect it. They'll fight for their own enslavement. That's the reason why in that film, which is very analogous to real life, they can't awaken everybody because some people are just so stone cold asleep to that thinking pattern that it threatens their worldview if you try to tell them something different. So back to that pollution analogy again, you can never negate the effects of the pollution entirely. However, what you can do when you become aware is you can take measures to sort of insulate yourself and protect yourself against the negative effects of it. So one of the most damaging parts of this societal paradigm that's really insidious and quite systemic is that failure is a bad thing. It's drilled into us as soon as we start school. You fail your exam, you're a bad person, you've failed. Like even the word fail, it almost implies that it's like done and there's nothing else after it. And I was thinking back to sort of some of my experiences when I was at school. The way some of the teachers, like their attitude towards this was almost sociopathic, which is quite a frightening prospect when you think about it. And you've probably heard people say this in other videos, you know, it's important that we need to change our relationship to how we view failure, especially if you're trying to create something new. But I think it would really be beneficial to just have a think about how far-reaching the implications of that belief system actually are. Because it's easy to think of it in terms of something big, like when you're trying to create something, oh yeah, you know, I need to learn and move on. But I think we take this into so many areas and we're sort of playing out this belief system without really knowing it. It could be like you speak to somebody and you maybe say something a bit embarrassing. Instead of just sort of laughing it off, we tend to really dwell on that, and it's because of we think of it as a failure. And remember, in the paradigm, failure is bad, so we then kind of tar that all with the same brush. You probably will find that if you're in this self-improvement space, as many people are and then tend to think this way, then your behaviour in any moment hinges upon absolute success and paradise, or catastrophe on an absolute razor's edge. This is just completely inaccurate to the reality of how things actually are, and the pain that you feel when you fail is generated entirely by you and nobody else. And the reason people engage in this self-punishment or like self-flagellation is they believe that that's going to prevent them from doing the same thing in the future, from slipping up again, or it's going to somehow strengthen their current character. And this is the way the ego presents this to you in terms of it's a virtue. You know, you're engaging in this self-punishment in order that you don't do it again because you're trying to get better and stuff. But in fact, it's actually the opposite of that, and it just weakens the self-esteem. So going back to what we said earlier, like, you must look at these patterns over time and ask, has this way of operating actually worked for you? And I think you'll find it hasn't. And the reason for that is that reality is a literal mirror. So even though you think you're doing something virtuous and you're trying to become better, you're presenting a negative energy to the world, because you're in a sense of like lower self-esteem, because you feel like you've failed and, oh shit, I failed, I can't do it again. And because it's a literal mirror, it doesn't care what you actually want, it cares what you put into it. So you're just going to get back more similar situations to trigger those emotions once again. This way of thinking actually makes it harder to progress, and what it does is it raises the level of importance of that action to you. And when something's really important to us, we're like hyper focused on it all the time. Like if you imagine I told you to walk across a plank of wood on the floor, you know, you could easily do that with your eyes closed, but now if I raise that plank above 2 skyscrapers, even though it's the same action relatively that you're doing, it would be very, very difficult, and you'd be hyper focusing on every step that you take because the results are catastrophic. If you think about that in terms of the way we approach these self-improvement behaviours, like, oh, I don't want to relapse, that level of importance that we place on it makes us hyper focus on the thing, and it can generate into something that we become anxious and scared about when it's actually supposed to be something originally that we were using to help ourselves. Having something that's so important to you all the time makes it actually harder to achieve, because it knocks you out of flow state. If there's one thing that'll knock you out of flow, it's raising the level of importance of something, which is why in my training videos I've said a lot of times to approach your sessions with no expectations, because when you have high expectations that the session must be amazing today, that's raising the level of importance of it. And then if it isn't, then you feel bad after it, and that's just not helpful to improving. And I know it's difficult to do, because when we identify something that means a lot to us, automatically there's going to be importance put around it. You still do the actions that you want to do, but you must let go of the outcome if possible, or as much as possible. And it's something that you can't just drop like that. It's like you have to work at this over time, and you have to bring awareness to the patterns that you're doing, because if you don't do that, then again, like I've said in all of these videos so far, you're just going to repeat a cycle because you're unaware of what's going on. You see this so much with guys in the semen retention and nofap communities, where they see a relapse as like absolute failure and it's a catastrophe and they've lost all their gains. And because they view it in a way where it's so bad, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they do lose their benefits. But it's not because they actually relapsed, it's because they feel so bad about the relapse that then it creates the reality going forward with that reality mirror. So what are they going to get back from reality? It can't be any other way. There's a story about this Russian mystic, a guy called Gurdjieff, in which he used to sort of teach people like self-improvement, and it's called magic sometimes, which is like, you know, creating your own reality. And there was a guy that came to him and said like, yeah, I want to learn the ways of this stuff, I want to learn how to do it. And Gurdjieff said to him, okay, so in order to learn you need to quit smoking. And so the guy goes away, you know, he quits smoking and comes back 2 weeks later and he says, now I'm ready, I've quit smoking, you know, I'm ready to learn. And Gurdjieff said to him, now start smoking again, but don't become addicted to it. And I think that story is so apt to what we're speaking about in this video, because, you know, the definition of addiction is something like compulsively doing a behaviour that you want to stop but don't feel that you can. Again, going to those guys in the nofap and semen retention communities that think literally like, I know it sounds extreme, but you do see this in those forums where they think literally their life's almost over because they've relapsed, and it's just placing way too much importance on it. And when you do that, those things just hold so much power over you. In operating from this, what I would call very unconscious mindset, it makes what you're trying to move towards and achieve much more difficult than it actually needs to be. Again though, this is just another sort of smoke screen, and it seems more difficult, but it doesn't actually change the reality. It's just the perception, because what we perceive is our reality, even if it's not true. Perception is everything. And that can be dispelled by even just taking the smallest actions towards what you want to do and letting go of some of that importance and that meaning behind what you call failure. Now, in order to cultivate awareness around these patterns that you may be unconsciously enacting, I would suggest meditating for like 10 to 20 minutes every day. But do not approach this with the same all or nothing mentality that you've probably been approaching other things with, because then that will create its own level of importance again. Consistency is something that happens over time, but it certainly does not mean perfection. And I think people get the two a little bit intermingled sometimes, but they're quite different. And meditation has a cumulative effect over time, and you'll begin to see these patterns that you're operating from a higher perspective. And it's almost like you go from being the video game character that is just enacting whatever he does in the video game to being the player of the video game. So the character in the game has no idea why he's going to run to this village or he's going to fight these enemies. The video game player knows exactly why he's doing it. It's important to recognize that these bad habits that you're doing, you know, like avoiding challenge or doing some kind of vice or addiction that you don't really want to do, an unconscious part of you is deriving some benefit from that, and you're actually doing it because you think it's good for you in some misguided way. Because we don't do anything that we don't think is going to benefit us. That just doesn't make logical sense. And a part of you now might be saying something like, no, I really do want to quit this thing, and, you know, of course I don't want to do it and stuff. And that's true consciously, but this takes place below the level of conscious awareness. And it's like, it could be all manner of things, but often it'll be a protection mechanism that's trying to sort of stop you moving forward in something. Maybe you want to start your business, for instance, or you want to work on your business more, but you just can't get yourself to do it. Consciously, it's a very frustrating thing, but like, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg there. There's a vast world of thoughts and belief systems underneath that's actually calling the shots. So it could be that your unconscious believes that if you did move forward with that business, that you'd lose friends, for instance, because people would think you were just after money, or like your family would judge you because you're not doing the status quo that they all did and just get a job. If you're still in doubt that a part of you is deriving some benefit from these actions, it's because you intellectually might understand it, but you don't actually know it. So if I told you to put your hand on a hot stove and hold it there for 10 seconds, you wouldn't even think of doing that, because you know without a doubt that that's going to cause you to get burned. That's a vastly different thing from me intellectually thinking to myself, oh yeah, maybe if I put my hand on there it would burn me. It's like, it doesn't even enter your mind to do that, because you just simply know it as an absolute fact. And so if you knew that these behaviours that you're doing that you're not happy with or you're not proud of were absolutely not helping you at all, then you wouldn't do them. They would become illogical. But there's a split within your psyche somewhere, and that is why you must become aware. I don't just mean, again, intellectually, I mean really aware. You're introspecting, you're contemplating things, and you really look at your own patterns, because so many people are just living a life and they don't have any clue that they're enacting patterns, and they'll go their whole lives from, you know, cradle to grave doing that and have no awareness of what's going on. And if you want to do something in this world that's like, you know, different, that's outside of the norm, and you are not doing any introspective work, you've got absolutely no chance. The first thing that comes up to you, you're going to be pulled off track. So what most people do in those situations when they do relapse and do a bad habit or fail to do the good habits is they start to dwell upon that situation, and what you focus on expands. So even though you're thinking that this is, you know, if I focus on it, it's going to stop me doing it again in the future, you're giving energy to the negative situation and you'll just get more of it, because I've already said about 10 times reality is a literal mirror. So instead you must, again, I know I keep saying this word, develop awareness around what happened in that situation. So upon relapsing into something, or if you've noticed you've not been living up to who you want to be, get a journal out and really dissect that situation and really look at what led up to it. How did it make you feel afterwards? How did it impact other actions after it happened, in the days and sort of weeks after it happened, depending on what the bad habit is. In doing that, you're developing a greater understanding of yourself and why you're doing these things. You have to be compassionate and kind with yourself when you do this, because chastising yourself only makes you spiral even further. So see these things as learning opportunities and understand what happened, because when you do this and bring enough understanding to these patterns, eventually they start to seem illogical to you and you just wouldn't do them anymore. Again, with that hot stove thing, you just know it's illogical, you wouldn't even think of it. And this is actually the level that you can get to with bad habits that you used to do. There's things I used to do that now I don't even think of doing them, because I just know without a doubt that they are not helping me at all. But the only way to discover that is to understand yourself and bring more awareness to that situation. For journaling like this, I would suggest using an actual notebook and a pen, like a more traditional method, rather than typing on a computer, because the act of, physically writing and seeing it on that paper in front of you gives you some distance so that you can observe it more objectively. You're also going to avoid the temptation of like opening tabs and getting distracted and things. So whenever a relapse occurs, instead of self-flagellating and chastising yourself, get the journal out and do this process. And it's going to be the last thing that you want to do, though. You're going to have every reason in the book not to do it, and you're going to, especially if you've been thinking in this negative way of yourself for a certain amount of time, you're going to naturally go down that pathway. We could call the part of you that engages in the bad habits or urges you to do them as the lower self, and the lower self is incredibly invested in keeping you as you are, and it will do everything in its power in order to ensure that. So when you set out on a new path and make the decision that you're going to grow and change, your lower self immediately senses this as a challenge and a threat, and it knows that if you're successful in this new pursuit, then its current way of operating is no more, and so it rallies the defences. An animal is at its most dangerous when it's cornered and has nowhere to go. And this is also the reason why the good habits feel difficult to do, because the ego is offering feelings of resistance in order to urge you not to do them or to try its best to stop you doing them. And the vices, the addictions, the bad habits feel very comfortable. It uses that pain-pleasure principle in order to keep you invested in acting in a certain way and not in another way. This is where the ego will start to play all of its best hands to stop you. This is why initially when you start out doing something that you think is a good thing, you might actually start to feel worse, because it's like the ego backlashing against you and trying to keep you where you are. So this is where some of the, skeletons in the closet or your darkest shadow aspects can really rise to the surface and start to become problematic. But it's just that attempt, that smokescreen, in order to derail you from where you're going. Remember, when you start to feel these really uncomfortable feelings and these things start to happen, although it's very unpleasant, this is actually a good thing. If you can see it like that, it can be really helpful, because the ego's in panic and it's mounting a backlash against you. If it wasn't in fear, and if these things weren't actually helping you to move the needle and become who you want to be, then it wouldn't actually have had to employ that strategy in the first place. And sometimes in this situation, even things like your worst fears can actually manifest, and that's because in order to actually stop your progression, it needs to make you really believe and buy into what it's kind of putting in front of you. If you imagine it's just like putting all of these different like illusions in front of you to stop you seeing the light and stop you seeing forwards, you have to believe in them to take them seriously, and that's why it employs this strategy. Sit with the uncomfortability and then just continue to move towards where you want to go, no matter how scary the tricks of the ego are. In the biblical story, Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel was brought face to face with the lions, and obviously they appeared very scary and stuff like that. But instead of accepting his fate and buying into that fear and feeling like it was all over for him, he actually turned away, which is very analogous to how we should look towards what we actually want instead, because remember, what you focus on expands. And so Daniel turned away and instead prayed to God, and he was saved. Despite all the ego's tricks and mechanisms and fears that it will use in order to get you to buy into its narrative, it can never fully eradicate your higher self. In fact, it can't harm the higher self at all. It can just make enough noise to where the higher self seems insignificant and drowned out, but it's always whispering to you somewhere. Despite all the setbacks and failures, I'm sure you can relate to the fact that even when you do fail and you feel at your absolute worst, there's always something urging you on. There's always that quiet whisper. And the higher self is also the part of us that engages that state of dissatisfaction when we're not living in alignment with our true selves and living up to who we can be. And the reason it does this is because it loves you unconditionally, and it doesn't judge you on your actions. It doesn't matter how much you've sinned, it will never abandon you. Listen exclusively to that voice of the higher self and cultivate strength in this area, and just disregard anything else opposing that. Another good book I'd recommend for this, which is one of my favourites, is called The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer, and that will really help you, especially in this area, but it's just a great book for sort of a way to operate in life in general. It doesn't matter if you fail once or twice, or it doesn't matter how many times you fail. It means we need to look at this over a long game. So the new paradigm, I guess, that I'm suggesting in this video is one of presence and bringing understanding to our behaviour, and really kind of understanding the way we're operating and then making adjustments from there, instead of catastrophizing on a relapse and thinking it's all over. That's the old paradigm. It's the punishment paradigm of conditional love, where you only get praise and love when you do something good, and when you do something bad it's withheld from you, and that does nothing for your self-image. It takes time. It's, you know, you've been thinking a certain way for absolutely years. No matter, you know, how many years you've lived, the majority of that you've been thinking in this certain way. So it's going to take some time, and that's why we need to have that long game approach and see consistency happening over a long game rather than hinging on one failure. It doesn't make sense. A simple analogy would be a guy that's overweight going to the gym and he's furious because he hasn't got a six-pack after the first day, or like he, you know, eats a donut and then he thinks all of his progress is lost over months. It's just not a healthy mindset to operate from. If you're able to persist in all of this despite what's going on around you, despite, you know, those threats, those illusions of the ego, I promise you that it'll make you into something you never could have believed was possible. So have faith, be consistent, be kind to yourself, and think about playing the long game, because it is possible.